In the late summer of 1903, as the first pale light of dawn touched the surface of the Aegean Sea, a small cargo vessel drifted quietly away from the port of Heraklion. It was an ordinary departure. No crowds watching, no fanfare, nothing that suggested this voyage would be remembered by anyone. Ships like it left the harbor every day, carrying olive oil, tools, and dried goods to distant island settlements scattered across the western waters. 11 men were on board, most of them seasoned sailors, who had spent more years at sea than on land. Their faces carried the marks of long voyages. The salt, the wind, the fatigue of a life lived between shifting shores. Leading them was Captain Valas, a man in his 50s who preferred silence over unnecessary talk. He knew these routes intimately and trusted the sea as one trusts an old companion, cautiously, but without fear. The early hours of the journey offered nothing unusual. The crew worked through their regular tasks, tightening ropes, checking supplies, adjusting the sails to catch what little breeze the day offered. By sunset, they had reached a stretch of open water that lay between several uninhabited islands, a familiar route, a safe route, a route they had crossed many times. Night settled like a velvet curtain over the sea. The wind faded until the sails hung motionless, and the waves softened into long, slow breaths. It was the kind of calm that made even experienced sailors lower their guard. Among the men keeping watch that night was Petro, the youngest sailor on the ship. He was not a man given to superstition or sailors' tales. He'd grown up with the noise of the harbor, the clatter of cargo, the reality of storms and broken masts. Myths meant nothing to him. Yet, he would later write that the sea felt different that night. Different in a way he could not name. While he stared across the water, a faint sound drifted toward him. At first, it was so soft he thought it might be something carried in his mind rather than through the air. It wasn't wind, nor the creaking of wood, nor anything mechanical. It was melodic, gentle, almost like someone humming far away. He turned to look for its source, expecting to find one of the crew idly singing to stay awake. But the men nearby were silent, half lost in their own thoughts. The sound did not come from the deck. He stood still, straining his ears. The melody was clearer now, but its direction was impossible to determine. It did not approach, nor fade. It simply existed, everywhere and nowhere at once, like a voice echoing through a house you've never visited. Petro called over the nearest sailor, asking quietly if he heard anything. The man frowned, listened, then nodded in unease. He had heard the same sound and assumed Petro was the one humming. A third man confirmed it as well. He had noticed it minutes earlier, but thought the other two were responsible. Only then did the three men understand that none of them were the source. Curiosity drew Petro toward the railing. As he leaned over the edge, he noticed something else, something he didn't immediately recognize as unusual. The water surrounding the ship was unnaturally smooth, not just calm, smooth, as if a layer of glass had settled over the sea. The melody hovered above that stillness, delicate yet persistent. When they woke Captain Valas, he stepped onto the deck without irritation, as though he had expected the call. He listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the black surface below. After a long moment, he asked in a low voice, "Has the sound moved since you first heard it?" Petro answered yes. He couldn't explain how he knew it, but he was certain the melody was shifting, drifting closer. The captain gave no further comment. He simply stood there, waiting, as if the sea itself were about to speak. Over the next minutes, the sound grew clearer, not louder, but clearer. as if whatever produced it was slowly rising toward the surface. Even the men still waking from sleep felt it immediately. The strange impression that the song was no longer coming from the vast darkness around them, but from just beneath the hull. And though no one admitted it aloud, each man felt the same unsettling truth. The sea was no longer a silent witness to their journey. It was listening, and something within it was approaching. For a long stretch, no one on the ship spoke. The men gathered near the center of the deck, instinctively distancing themselves from the railings without any order being given. It wasn't fear exactly. None of them understood enough to be afraid yet. It was something subtler, the way a person stiffens when stepping into a room that feels colder than the rest of the house. The melody continued its slow rise from the dark water, now steady, delicate, and disturbingly close. Petro noticed that even when he turned away from the sea, the sound didn't fade behind him. It felt as if it traveled with him, as though whatever voice was producing it had fixed its attention on the ship itself. The quiet was broken when an older sailor named Konstantinos stepped forward. The man had spent more than 3 decades at sea, long enough to ignore most strange noises. Yet he stood at the bow with a strange rigidity, his gaze locked downward. "Look," he said quietly, not shouted, not alarmed, just certain. Petro was one of the first to reach him. When he leaned over the railing, he understood immediately why Konstantinos had called them. The water beneath the bow was dark but unnervingly still, reflecting the faint starlight like polished stone. And beneath that thin reflective layer, something pale moved, a shape, long, smooth, slowly drifting just beneath the surface, keeping pace with the ship. At first, Petro's mind raced to familiar explanations. Fish, debris, perhaps a reflection. But the shape was too defined, too deliberate in the way it glided. It did not sway like a fish. It did not flick a tail or bend its body. It floated, like a person might, suspended in water, allowing the current to carry them. A lantern was brought forward, its warm glow sweeping across the sea in an arc of gold. But the moment the light touched the surface, the pale form shifted, sliding away from the glow as if it sensed its reach. The lantern revealed only a trace of it, a pale edge slipping silently into the deeper blackness. The men exchanged looks, uncertain, tense, waiting for someone to explain what none of them could. Then a voice from the port side said, "There's another." The crew rushed across the deck. A second shape mirrored the first one, drifting alongside the hull with the same eerie calm. The same refusal to reveal itself fully to the lantern's circle of light. Not long after, a third sailor murmured, "Something surfaced. I saw. Hair. Hair." The word struck the group like a physical blow. The sailor described strands, long, dark, spreading across the water's surface for only a heartbeat before slipping under again. Not clumped like seaweed, but fanned outward, just as hair floats when a person lies face up beneath still water. 2 men claimed to have seen the same thing moments later. No one dared to shout. Their voices remained low and tight, as if raising their volume might draw something closer. And still the melody continued, weaving through the air around them, no longer distant, no longer gentle. It was clearer now, too clear. A braided chorus of soft voices layered atop one another in a harmony that was neither beautiful nor unpleasant, simply unnatural. Petro felt something then, an odd sensation he could not put into words. A pull, not physical but insistent. A suggestion. a quiet urge to step closer to the edge and listen more carefully, to let the sound fill every part of him. He resisted the impulse, but only barely. Others were not as steady. A young sailor, the one they called the boy from Rhodes, drifted toward the railing as though sleepwalking. His expression was blank, his posture relaxed, his eyes half-lidded, as if he were listening to someone whispering directly into his ear. Two men grabbed him before he leaned too far over. When they pulled him back, he blinked as though waking from a dream. It took him a long moment to speak, and when he finally did, his voice was thin, confused. Someone down there said my name." No one answered him. No one needed to. Every man on that deck understood now that the melody was not merely sound, it was directed, intentional, calling, and it was coming from something moving beneath the ship, something that did not want to be seen, only heard. The hour before dawn is a strange time at sea. It is the moment when the world feels suspended between darkness and light, when the mind grows tired enough to doubt itself, and even the bravest sailor feels the edge of unease sharpen inside him. By then, the entire crew was awake, drawn to the deck by instinct or by the music that refused to release its grip on them. The shapes beneath the surface had multiplied. Petro counted 4 on the starboard side alone, 4 pale outlines drifting in perfect harmony with the vessel's movement. The water around the hull remained unnaturally flat, as though the sea itself were holding its breath. Beyond that still circle, however, the real ocean moved again, shifting in low swells under the faint glow of the stars. The melody no longer felt distant. It wrapped itself around the men like a slow, deliberate whisper. It was not loud, not in the sense of volume, but it was everywhere, threading through the air, beneath the boards, inside their thoughts. Petro tried to focus, tried to keep his mind grounded, but concentration had become a labor, each simple thought weighed down by the constant presence of the sound. It was Captain Vallis who finally broke the silence. "Stay away from the rails," he said quietly. "No one stands alone." His voice was steady, but Petro could hear the strain beneath it. The crew obeyed without question. The night had reached a point where orders felt less like commands and more like lifelines. Yet, even in the center of the deck, the sense of being watched, or perhaps beckoned, did not fade. The sun climbed higher as the hours passed, warming the deck and softening the cold stiffness that had clung to the crew during the night. But no amount of daylight could erase what had happened. The men worked in silence, performing each task with mechanical precision, their eyes betraying a quiet dread they didn't know how to express. Captain Vallis kept the ship on its altered course, refusing to steer south again. Every few minutes he would glance toward the horizon, as if expecting the sea itself to rise up behind them. Petro noticed the change in him. The captain's movements were sharper, his gaze narrower, his breathing slower than usual. He had not slept since being awakened in the night, but he carried himself with the rigid focus of a man who understood that exhaustion was safer than uncertainty. The crew avoided the railings. Even under broad daylight, no one leaned over the edge to watch the water slide past. They kept to the center of the ship, each man quietly struggling with the same unspoken fear, that perhaps the singing had not been the end of the encounter. By midday, the sea had returned completely to its natural rhythm. A faint breeze pushed the sails, the waves rocked the hull in familiar movements, and seabirds circled overhead once more, a sight that brought visible relief to the older sailors. Their return meant something. It meant life had reclaimed the waters around them. It meant the night had passed, or so they hoped. Petro was sorting ropes near the bow when he heard footsteps approaching. It was the young sailor, the boy from Rhodes, his expression dazed, as though he'd just awoken from a dream he couldn't recall. He stood beside Petro without speaking, staring out at the open water with a kind of quiet longing. Petro hesitated before asking, "You feel it again, don't you?" The young man didn't look at him. He simply nodded, barely noticeable. "It's not the sound," he whispered. "It's the memory of it." Petro felt a chill, despite the sun beating down on them. Before he could respond, a sharp whistle broke the moment. One of the lookouts shouted from the stern, pointing toward the distant south. The entire crew reacted instantly, rushing to the railing, only to stop short, remembering the captain's warning. They crowded just close enough to see. Far behind them, where the sea stretched empty in every direction, the water shimmered. A long, pale disturbance rippled across the surface. Not fast, not aggressive, but deliberate, as if something beneath the waves was gliding just under the surface, following their path, tracking them. Captain Vallis was the last to step forward. He stared at the distant distortion for a long, tense moment. His jaw tightened. "Full sail," he said simply. The command snapped through the crew like a jolt of electricity. Men ran to the rigging, adjusting lines and pulling canvas until the ship strained forward with renewed speed. The vessel surged northward, cutting through the waves as if fleeing a storm none of them could see. Petro dared one last glance south. The water had calmed again. Whatever had caused the disturbance was no longer visible, but he couldn't shake the impression that the sea was not done with them, that it was merely watching, waiting, moving beneath the surface where their eyes could not follow. As the afternoon deepened, the crew tried to occupy themselves with tasks, anything to distract their minds. Yet, every man occasionally paused, listening, not for sound, but for the absence of it. They feared silence now. Silence meant the sea was thinking. It wasn't until later, as daylight began to fade, that the ship reached a new section of open water, an expanse known for its strong winds and busy roads. Other vessels came into view on the horizon, distant but reassuring. The crew murmured among themselves for the first time since dawn. The world felt normal again, filled with the presence of other sailors, other lives, other sounds, but night was approaching again. And as the sky shifted toward twilight, Petro felt a twisting knot in his chest. He realized the terror they had left behind wasn't the kind that stayed in one place. It wasn't tied to a single stretch of water or a single night. It was tied to them. They had heard the voice beneath the sea, and in the quiet moments between one breath and the next, Petro feared that the voice had heard them too. Night returned slowly, spreading across the sky like ink dissolving into water. But this time, the crew faced it differently. They stayed close together, speaking in low, steady voices, forcing their minds to remain anchored in the mundane. Cargo lists, weather, old stories that usually soften the hours. Anything to keep their thoughts away from the memory of that haunting melody. By the time darkness settled fully, the busy shipping lane was behind them, and the ship sailed through a quieter region. The nearest vessel was little more than a ghost on the horizon. The sea, though calm, held a stillness that pressed against the men's ears like thick cloth. They waited. Petro stood by the mast, arms crossed tightly, eyes scanning the waves. Every creak of wood, every shift of rope, every breath of wind felt louder than it should have. He knew the others felt it too. The tension, the unspoken fear that the quiet wouldn't last. Captain Vallis remained at the helm. His silhouette was rigid, carved against the faint starlight. He had not once stepped away from the wheel since altering the course. Petro wondered if the captain believed that if he let go, even for a moment, the sea might reclaim what it had almost taken. The first sign came not as a sound, but as a feeling, a pressure, a tightening in the air, subtle at first, like the heaviness before a storm. Petro felt the hairs rise on his arms. He looked toward the starboard side, and though he saw nothing, his instinct whispered the truth. Something was there. Then, barely audible at first, the melody returned. Not the gentle drifting hum of the previous night. This time, the sound rose with purpose, weaving through the darkness like a thread pulled tight. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakably closer, as if the sea had been following them silently all day, waiting for night to cloak its approach. The crew froze, each man snapping his gaze toward the sound. A voice, or many voices, sang just beneath the surface. Petro felt the same strange pull as before, stronger now, sharper, almost intimate. A whisper brushing the edge of consciousness, forming something that might have been words, or might have been his own name. The boy from Rhodes pressed a hand against his head, fighting the urge to move. Two sailors immediately stepped beside him, gripping his arms before he could drift toward the rail again. "It's different," the boy murmured. "It's speaking clearer." But Petro disagreed. The voice wasn't clearer, it was closer. The water at the starboard side began to glow faintly, a pale shimmer spreading outward like moonlight dissolving into the waves. Shapes rose from the depths, not fully, not breaking the surface, but rising just enough that their outlines blurred beneath the water. Long, slender forms, movement without motion, the impression of faces that never quite emerged, and hair, dark strands unfurling like ink, floating upward before sinking again. The crew recoiled instinctively, stepping back as the shapes drifted closer to the hull. The singing grew layered, voices overlapping in a sound that felt more like an emotion than a melody. Captain Vallis shouted his first true command of fear that night. "Away from the rails!" The men obeyed instantly, but the ship slowed, not because the wind had weakened, because the sea itself resisted. Petro grabbed the nearest rope as the vessel lurched, its momentum fading, as though something below pressed gently upward against the keel, holding it in place. The sails billowed, straining with wind that should have propelled them forward, but they barely moved. The singing rose again, surrounding them like a circle tightening. For the first time, Petro felt something beneath the sound, an intent, a longing, a presence that wanted not to harm them, but to claim them. Captain Vallis reacted with the instinct of a man who understood danger the moment he felt it. He seized the wheel, turning it sharply. The ship groaned, fighting the unseen resistance, sliding inch by inch through the thickened water. "Help the sails!" he shouted. The crew leapt into motion, pulling ropes, adjusting angles, giving every ounce of strength the ship needed. The vessel strained forward, shuddering like a living creature trying to break free of invisible hands. Slowly, terribly slowly, the glow beneath the water began to fall behind. The shapes sank lower. The voices softened. The hold on the hull weakened. Until finally, after what felt like an eternity, the ship broke through, surging forward into open, unbound sea. The singing did not end abruptly. It faded. Gracefully, mournfully, like a farewell whispered from far below. A sound full of longing, not anger. And then it disappeared entirely. The ship sailed through the rest of the night without incident. 2 days later, they reached their destination port. The logbook mentioned nothing except a single line written in Captain Vallis's meticulous hand. Unusual sounds at sea, no source identified. No one filed a formal report. No one sought attention. Some spoke of it only once before vowing never to speak of it again. But Petro wrote his account carefully, honestly, without claiming to understand what he had witnessed. He never used the word siren. He never referenced legends or folklore. Yet anyone who knew the stories recognized the familiar signs, the voices, the water, the pull, the unseen presence beneath the waves. The crew of that voyage never took that route again. Some dangers at sea are storms, some are currents, and some are simply waiting.